welcome to the talk today. I'm going to talk about universities to unicorns. I've had the pleasure of working in a lot of different fields, including academia. And what I've started to find is there's certain characteristics of success that go along with trying to start unicorns in a very early setting in the universities, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So a little bit about me. I have done a lot of startups, several startups. I've done 2 startups as a CTO, 2 exits, including 1 IPO, and I'm also an advisor for Boldstart Venture Capital, which is in New York. Currently, I am a retired Chief Information Security Officer with Deloitte, working in a lot of different industries, and I've worked in academia in Johns Hopkins, Columbia, and currently serving as a vice dean of a university in Korea. So all of those sort of sum up my insights, my views on starting unicorns, starting startups at all from a university setting. So the growing global unicorn landscape, now this is from 2017. Of course, we've had some since then, but I would say that there is a growing unicorn landscape across the world. And it's not just dedicated anymore towards Silicon Valley, even though we'll talk a little bit about that. And it also says then that there's opportunities. There's opportunities in lots of different countries to join the unicorn club, as they say. And the over $1 billion valuation of a private company, and the time frame to get there is compressing dramatically as well. And so there's many students, I think, in a university setting that are looking at this saying, yeah, I can do this too. So, it's a good chance for us to look at how does that work? Unicorns versus growth firms. There's a real difference here. There's the startups, many startups, and they don't ever become unicorns. It's not that they're not successful, it's they don't grow to a certain size. In between a unicorn and a startup is what we would say is a scale up. They do get to things such as a 10% annualized growth in employment. If you look at how the European Union and OECD characterize that for a high growth firm, scale ups 20% annual growth. Of course, the unicorns are the ones then that are valued at over 1 billion. And so there's this kind of trajectory. There's a path to how that tends to occur. Universities have a role to play in that, and we've seen that from looking at the research. One of the research had shown that the top 50 universities, if you look at the unicorn population, those companies valued over 1 billion, 100% of them, all of them, had someone in a leadership position who had an undergraduate degree from a top 50 university. That's amazing, really. So we do hear that some very notable companies that have joined the Unicorn Club have founders who have not even graduated from university, and that's true. But if you look at the leadership team, all of them have someone that have come from that environment. And it's, to me, indicates that universities still educate in ways that tend to encourage entrepreneurship and encourage that ability to grow a company, even though some, in fact many, 4 out of 5 don't have someone in a leadership position who has gone to university. Every company has at least one person in the leadership who has gone to a top 50 university. Curriculums also have a impact on the startups. And if you look at the most popular subjects to study for unicorns, now, this may have a historical bent to it, that we're looking back in time, and this may not be true in the future, but what we can say today is the most popular subjects for unicorn founders to have studied is MBA, business, right? That they look at business models and they look at those characteristics of a business which are necessary for them to know in order to start a business. But we also see this growing trend of businesses, because it's technology driven, to study computer science. And so we see a lot of that. The net of this too is that 7 out of the 10 alumni who were influenced to start a business, they were influenced by the subjects that they learned. Now, they may not have finished those subjects, but where they started was it gave them some idea, and it gave them some drive to then want to start a business which eventually become a unicorn. There is a shifting landscape. I mentioned before about the technology, and not all technology is created equal. That the technology unicorns in the past, and we're generalizing here, they come from consumer, a lot of consumer businesses, the B2C and the media and the peer-to-peer stuff. A lot of that was happening, but now we're seeing a lot of enterprise tech. In fact, in 2019, enterprise technology is outpacing, is surpassing consumer tech startups in the amount of money that they're raising. So when we look at fintech and blockchain, and even blockchain applied to places like agriculture and consumer goods and food, AI, robotics, all that in Korea, what we'd say is this Sacha Sanop, which is fourth industrial revolution, all that's really becoming dominant now as we look at the shifting startup landscape. So as they look at the subjects that they study, that then tends to get influenced by, okay, what does the market want? What is the market funding? And now we're seeing enterprise tech really starting to become dominant in the funding. The universities have a dilemma, however, and it's how do they help initiate, how do they help start, how do they help grow the startups that lead to unicorns? And there's somewhat of a disconnect. There's somewhat of a tension here, because incubators are really becoming popular as the place to house startups. And when they look at startups, usually it's the students who are actively studying now. And the problem with this, though, is unicorn founders tend to be a little bit older. What that really means is, and we'll see in a minute, that they start their companies after they graduate. And the disconnect here and the dilemma for universities is that they tend to focus on the students who are currently studying, but when they graduate is when they have time to actively grow their companies. But the incubators don't actively support graduates of the universities. They support the students who are there now. And this is the dilemma. Students will tend to be challenged by how much time they have to be doing their studies versus focusing on a startup. And this is the dilemma for universities. University founders, the startups, lack experience. And this kind of goes towards when unicorns start their companies. It's after they graduate, because they start to get that experience. They learn in universities, but they get the experience in these startup companies, which allow them then to go and create these startup companies which lead to unicorns. And they surround themselves with founders who have previously worked at venture capital-backed listed businesses. So all this says experience matters, having the time to grow the business matters, and all that tends to happen after they graduate. So what's the role for the universities to play then? University incubators then have what I would call a success gap, where incubation is integral to the success of the business, but incubation is necessary, is needed more for the graduates of universities rather than the undergraduates. There's one quote here by one study that graduates need different support than the students, but most incubators have no or very few students because they're in class, right? But that's where the emphasis is on the incubators, and so they're kind of targeting the wrong population, if you will. And for masters and PhD, when they sort of have that freedom now to start investigating the business, then the incubators really are useful. But it's a little challenging for the current undergraduate students. Incubators, too, from what I've seen in universities, focus on, does anyone have a great idea? That seems to be what they're doing, is trying to say, okay, let's have an idea competition. And, frankly, it's only the startup. It's only the start. Having the idea is just the beginning to being able to validate those ideas and create the minimum viable category, the IPR, initial product release, minimum viable product, all these sorts of things which lead towards validating that with customers. And this is where undergraduates in incubators tend to fail. They don't have the network. They don't have the sales and infrastructure set up where they can go meet the companies to validate the products. All that stuff is beyond their skill set, and the incubators don't give them the ability to connect to those things which they need. They don't have the network. So this go-to-market, the traction gap, really tends to kill a lot of startups in incubators in universities. And that it goes back to what I mentioned before about the university dilemma. And so the startups in the universities, in the incubators, run into a scalability problem. And it bears itself out when you look at the statistics. 42% of startups fail because there's no market need. And it's because they hadn't been able to adequately validate the product to market fit. They weren't able to test out the product with customers. They run into this very early valley of death, the crossing the chasm, which is very familiar to many of us. And so this first scalability challenge is what's faced by the incubators, the startups in the incubators in universities, and it tends to limit, I think, the ability for them to scale and to ultimately become a unicorn. What's missing in all of that? So, there's incubators set up in universities, but as I mentioned before, they don't have the network to test their products, test their ideas, pivot to what the market needs, and they're really limited, particularly outside of the Silicon Valleys, the growing New York area, for example, and other places. Particularly in Asia, where I am now, there's a limited ecosystem. And that ecosystem you can see on the slide includes many, many things which interact with each other. We have the universities and the research that they do. They tend to not react or interact much with each other. They're not interacting as much with the industry and companies and what those companies need. They're not connected as much with the angel investors and venture capitals, with the growing startup community and those growing unicorns which exist already. There's just a lot of interaction. This comes from the Bay Area, out of the um, Silicon Valley area, which you can see this constant exchange of ideas, the constant influx of investment, funding, the research, the constant even alumni plugging back into the community is missing in most incubators. And so when we look at the startup conditions and success for students who need to plug into this community to start exchanging ideas and interacting with venture capitalists and doing all that is really missing. And I think is a key component to this notion of universities to unicorns. You can look at very concrete characteristics of those ecosystems, having the large firms and the startups with them, and high financial returns for the entrepreneurs, early employees, so they encourage to do those startups. Human resources, so they can have a diverse team with lots of skill sets that have experience coupled with the founder's experience and maybe lack of experience. Business infrastructure, venture capital, and connected with global top-class universities. Not just the top 50 in the world, but the top universities in a particular country. The ability to access high-quality human capital, talent, in those human resource clusters around the universities. The role of government, industry, plugging into that. The open innovation and being able to monetize and scale out, spin out IPO and intellectual property. And you can see more of this, right? But the ecosystem characteristics need to be there to plug into the universities and be able to give them that ecosystem that they really don't have. And we can see then in a very summarized way, this is the Global Startup Ecosystem Report from last year. If you look at performance, funding, market reach, connectedness, talent, experience, knowledge, where things tend to shake out. And you can clearly see that the ecosystems that are around some of these cities enable them to be able to scale, create more startups, and ultimately produce more unicorns. There is a growing role also of regulatory sandboxes, particularly in environments that really need to be testing new business models in regulatory environments that are not used to them. And the regulatory sandboxes are becoming more popular. I think they're more necessary to the success of startups becoming unicorns in those countries where they are starting to grow those ecosystems which need to challenge the business models and regulatory environments that they're not familiar with. So it really goes to a scale-up mindset, scale-up business model that leads to universities to unicorns, and being able to have this ability and understand that scale-ups and how they enter the university incubators and begin that path towards unicorns need different things. They need to be able to plug into the ecosystems. They need to be able to get beyond the first scale-up challenges. They need to be able to do those things even if they're not graduates yet, and more likely that they will be graduates, and even when they leave university that they're being able to be supported. So I want to thank you for listening. To me, it's a very interesting challenge that universities have, and an interesting role, an important role. And I think we'll see more unicorns because of it. Thank you very much.